difficult issue. What is affordable housing and what's subsidized housing? We have a capitalist system and a market system, and obviously people who own a house and want to rent it, they want to get the best rent they can get. So that's the market, or the person who owns an apartment building and so on. Subsidized housing is when the government decides to build subsidized housing, and that obviously is what you would call affordable housing. But unfortunately, way back many years ago, when the Liberal federal government was in power, they did away with getting into the housing market and have not supplied any money whatsoever to the cities as far as housing is concerned. So we haven't had that kind of subsidized housing nearly to the extent that we had federally many years ago. The provincial government kept it up, and in fact, when I was in the provincial government, we did keep it up. At that time, the NDP decided to continue even though the federal government got out of it, and we were involved in many projects with the city government, and I went to a number of sites and cut the ribbon and so on with Mero, and you might remember, because the provincial government stayed in it. But that has come to an end. When the Liberals became into power provincially, they then did away with any of the money. So we don't have subsidized housing, and now we're trying to build affordable housing 20% below the market rate with incentives from the city and from the use of city land and so on, as the mayor has articulated. I think the mayor would probably be better suited to speak to the DCLs as well, but he's in a lot of negotiations with this and would probably be better to handle that.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify on the on rental housing, as Tim said, we had decades where rental housing wasn't being built in the city. The housing in the West End was built, most of it prior to the early mid-70s, when the federal program started to disappear for rental housing and for co-ops. So we've had decades without a significant supply being built every year. We were down to about 100 to 150 units of rental housing a year being built for the last decade. And so when we came in a couple of years ago, we said, what can we do as a city? What incentives can we put on the table? We're not going to see money from the federal government or the provincial government to get rental housing built, and more than half the city rents. So we had our staff look at that, and they came back to us saying, well, two big drivers are how much parking is in a new building, so we can dramatically reduce the requirements for parking spaces in new buildings, and that fits with our other goals to be a greener city and be more transit-oriented with our development. And the second was to not charge the development cost levies, which typically go for condo construction for private housing developments. The rationale there was they give the developers a break. If they're going to build rental housing, they don't have to pay that extra charge. Which is the same thing we do for commercial space. The city doesn't collect those levies for commercial space because we have job space in our city, particularly in the downtown. We've had a strategy to make sure we have metro core jobs in the downtown. We decided that for a period of time here, we'd try this out and we would relax those levies. We wouldn't charge the levies if people would build rental housing, and it's a commitment. Rental housing is permanent for the lifespan of the building. So because of those two pieces, we've ended up averaging over 500 units of rental housing a year for several years now. We're on about that pace. It was just enough to get the construction and development industry to say, you know what, we'll build these. We're not going to go laughing all the way to the bank on this. It's marginal for them, but for a couple of years there, they weren't building a lot of condos anyway, so it kept crews busy and kept some activity going in the city, which is important. So that program is now called Rental 100, And there's actually no negotiating with it. It is a set pattern. If you're going to commit to building rental housing, you can qualify for certain incentives, and that's going to deliver us rental housing. Ideally, we get more support. I keep pushing on the federal government for rental housing incentives, because they have capital gains tax, they have pieces that they can put on the table that used to exist up till the 70s, some of them up into the 90s, but those were stripped away. If we had a couple of those, then we could modify what we do as a city, and I think the parking one certainly makes sense for a number of reasons, but we would rather have incentives from the federal government than to be relaxing our DCLs permanently. But for time being, we have to have a baseline of rental housing getting built, or we have unbelievably low vacancy rates and no new supply coming online. So that's the reasoning.
What's a DCL?
DCL is a development cost levy. So it's a fee that's charged for new homes, new condo buildings in particular. That's based on the scale of the building. It's a formula.
I'm going to leave you guys with that, Mike. Hopefully you can all hear me again. And yes, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned what DCLs were. We're going to take a question from Twitter, but before I turn it over to Bob, to mention to you, there is a report from the city from 2011, which outlines the problems that the mayor was speaking to, has nice graphs about when rental housing was built, talks about these programs, and also looks at the homelessness issue as well as market housing ownership. So if you'd like us to send you a link to that, leave your name and we're happy to do that. And also to say there is a rental housing supply coalition, Metro Vancouver-wide. If you're interested in advocating for more rental housing, they're a really good body to join. Again, if you leave your name, we can follow up on that.
Okay, so this one's kind of related to that last one. Peter Sanford wants to know, what does Vision see for the future of the West End in terms of residential and commercial development, and what are the biggest challenges?
I'll give an intro for that one. The city, so we have the West End planning process going now, and that's what we are relying upon to shape the future of development for the West End. So the residents of the West End can say, this is what we need for housing, this is what we need for commercial space, job space, recreational space, this is where it should go. That's the whole purpose of that planning process. It was put off and ignored for many, many years by City Hall. Unfortunately, there used to be a practice of only one community a year, one neighborhood in the city per 3 years. So each term of City Council, there would only be one neighborhood plan that would be done, and we got hopelessly far behind in that. So we as a council decided a year and a half ago to say for this next term we want to have 4 plans in process, and the West End was top priority for that. So that's what's taking place now, basically planning it out. And that said, there's a lot of private land here, obviously, private land that has existing zoning and policy, and legally the city is required to respect that. So there are some constraints in terms of what comes forward. People bring stuff forward. Most of the development that happens in the city comes forward under the existing zoning and rules, and it just happens. The rezonings are actually a tiny fraction of the overall activity, and they're the tough ones, and that's what they pay us the big bucks to deal with.
They pay you the big bucks. The hardcore commission is not so much. Tim.
Speaking of big bucks, I just want to reiterate how important the West End community was, though, to get this West End planning process. And some of you might not. How many of you heard about the West End planning process? It's in quite a large number, and it was as a result of your pushing that this came into being. As the mayor said, only one came in every 3 years, and the West End was down. We were looking at 9 years away before this process was to come into being here. And because of the number of emails and letters and people who were on my doorstep saying that's got to change, and I put in motions in previous council when the MPA were in power and it didn't go anywhere. But we now have completely changed that so that we've moved the West End up to #1. And this process is ongoing right now. It's a 2-year process. We've got permanent staff from the city, planners that deal nothing but the West End. So it's a really exciting process, and I think it's a huge input from everyone in the West End. And I think you're going to find that we really end up with something significant.
So I was just saying to Bob, I think he's going to tweet out a link to where you can learn more about the West End planning process if you don't know about it already. Also, if you leave your name and contact, we'll be sure to get that to you. I did want Cherie to maybe talk about, for those that don't know, I used to be a school trustee whose liaison schools with West End back in the 80s, which is when I was about 5, but they were going to close down the schools in the West End because there were no kids here, and it was projected there'd be less and less. Now they're the busiest and most crowded schools in the city because we have had this demographic shift. So I wanted Cherie to speak a bit about those kind of, the challenge of that. It's not just housing and commercial, there's also services involved.
Sure. I think maybe just a little less than 10 years ago, a change was made where people can go to school outside of their catchment area. So you can go to school anywhere in the city. And so although we have 1,000 students in the West End itself, we do hear from parents who say that there are wait lists to get into the neighborhood school, wait lists to get into the magnet program that they're interested in. So for example, at King George, we have a strong international baccalaureate program. We also have an alternative school for kids who are seeking a smaller environment or maybe looking for an alternative to the regular classroom in other types of schools. And so there are pressures that come from a variety of sources that make parents anxious about whether or not they'll be able to keep their kids in the school closest to where they live. I think also the other thing that I wanted to mention that Andrea didn't touch on was the advantage that we have in terms of planning to make use of space across jurisdictions. So for example, at the West End Community Centre, a bit like Britannia, it's a good example of how we can have community centers, a community center, a library, and a school sharing space. And we take the same approach with childcare in terms of working across park and city and school board to use extra space, surplus space in schools and in park and communities center facilities to offer childcare, early learning, daycare, that kind of thing. So I think as we plan and as the community plan is developed, these types of issues will be important for us to hear at all 3 levels so that we can incorporate, we can look to the future and incorporate the needs of residents more fully.
Thank you, Cherie. I'm going to totally put Stephen Reagan on the spot because the piece we didn't answer was around businesses and what are the challenges there. Stephen is the Executive Director of the West End Business Improvement Association, the 2nd largest association of businesses in Vancouver, and he, I think, can speak well to what some of the challenges are for businesses.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, first of all,